So we have a very serious discussion today about a very complex issue that I have to say I think many of us feel we don't completely understand. And we have an extraordinary panel who really, really do understand the deep complexities of the Middle East, which really can't be translated into a kind of social media soundbite. So it's great that we have an hour to have some discussion and at least begin to get into some of the issues. On the far left, we have Jasmine El-Gamal, who is a former Middle East advisor at the Pentagon. She was country director for Syria and Lebanon at the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, and she was embedded with the 82nd Airborne Division when they crossed into Iraq from Kuwait in March 2003. Next to her, Ronen Bergman joins us from Tel Aviv. We're incredibly lucky to have you here. Ronen and his colleagues at the New York Times recently won the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on Israel and Gaza. And he's the author of the book you can see here, Rise and Kill First, which I've just finished, which looks long, but reads like a spy thriller. It is the true story of the development of Israel's security services, and rather like what we've seen in recent weeks, you sometimes feel that truth is actually stranger than fiction when you read that book. David McCloskey, next to him, has also written an extraordinary book which is fiction, but I suspect is based on his experience as a CIA officer with particular expertise in Syria, where and the book is set in the Syrian civil war, and of course we all want to know whether the protagonist is actually you, but we may come back to that question. And David joins us from Texas. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And next to me is Sir Alex Younger, who some of you will have seen being interviewed yesterday by Neil Ferguson, who has served his country with distinction in the army and also, of course, as chief, the longest serving chief of MI6. And Alex, of course, goes with the title of KCMG, which those of us in the corridors of Whitehall, where I first met you, know actually means kindly call me God.
But you can get promoted if you do rather better than me. You can become a GCMG, which is apparently God calls me God.
I wasn't going to mention that out of deference to you, but there we are. So, we're meeting at a really grim time for the Middle East. We're approaching the anniversary of the shocking Hamas attack last October. There are predictions that the whole region may be drawn into a wider war, and I think whatever view you take of the conflict, it's difficult not to feel despair, to be honest, at a situation that can feel intractable. I want to start, though, with the extraordinary events of this past week, with the attacks we assume by Israel on Hezbollah, the extraordinary use of pages where I understand that Hezbollah had originally decided to stop using other forms of communication which could easily be hacked and had started using pages which were much simpler, and of course somebody found a way to get into those pages and indeed the walkie-talkies. And in many ways, the real world does look stranger than fiction. So I wanted to start with Ronen, just on this particular issue, Ronen, just to give us your insights into this particular attack in the context of your wider book, which is about Israel's policy of target assassinations. What do we know about how those pages were made, and how does it fit into the wider context of Israel's assassination strategy?
Thank you. These are called buttons. Israel has been investing billions, many years of man labor, many people getting into immense risks, much of its resources into preparing these buttons. These buttons are massive infrastructure embedded into the enemy, whichever the enemy is, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and They are there to stay for a long time. They are there to inflict damage, confusion in a right moment, and that right moment is a doomsday scenario, is the really last resort. The buttons imagine that one country can take down the whole electricity network of another, or the internet. But this was prepared to be either the beginning of a massive Israeli attack, in case Israel decides to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon, or to stop a surprise attack from the other side in its execution, in case it was not predicted, it was not anticipated by Israeli intelligence. It was neither the case, and I'll get to this in a minute, but the point of that operation as an intelligence, young woman, intelligence officer at Mossad headquarters proposed back in 2018. She said, if Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, is so obsessed with not using cell phones, with moving to other means of communication, because the Israelis have Pegasus, because they are monitoring each cell phone, because they can open the cell phone for geolocation tracking and for as microphone and hack and dump the content of that machine. If Hezbollah is moving to using pagers are considered one of, well, no longer, but they were considered as one of the most safe means of communication, because they can only receive information. They are not transmitting information, so they cannot send to whoever any information about the person who's using them. So she said, let's move with him, let's move with Nasrallah to that hemisphere. Now, to take 4,500 pages, stop them in the chain of supply, open each one, tamper with it, embed the 12 grams of explosives and the other gear, that takes a lot of time and will probably be discovered. So Mossad became the chain of supply. This was a Mossad design, a Mossad device. And one of the commanders of the operation, when I asked him what was the most challenging moment, he said one of them was that when we got a real order from India for people actually want to use because it got a good name. And then how do you supply India with those devices that, of course, are not booby-trapped and do not have explosives?
So can I just ask you, was that order coming to the Taiwanese company or the Hungarian company that were supposedly involved in this, or who were they putting in the order to?
The Taiwanese company. This is a cluster of companies. Some of them are bona fide. Some of them are, whoever saw this Taiwanese COO, very embarrassed, finding himself in the midst of a Mossad network that now is involved with the killing of few and injuring of thousands of people in Lebanon. So there were parts in that cluster of companies that were bona fide, that were innocent, and parts that were controlled by Mossad. The one in Hungary was a Mossad front. They brought the devices from Israel. It was designed by Israelis, manufactured by Israelis. There are many challenges. One of them is how to disguise the explosive. The explosive, even when you open it, you don't see any explosive there, and how to disguise it, how to avoid any kind of sniffers in such as like airports. Hezbollah already understood that Israel is trying to poison its chain of imports. They need to import everything from outside of Lebanon. So they were looking into this. And in fact, the whole operation was just about to be discovered. There was a technician in Hezbollah who suspected he died before the operation started, before they exploded them, in a story that I just don't want to scoop myself. Oh, sorry.
We need to read the New York Times in a few weeks.
Yes, we'll read about that. But in any case, the point was to have those devices embed in where they were in case of need. And then the question is, of course, the moving from this beyond imagination operation that is more than any Netflix episode that we see. But what is the real impact, people in Israel ask, and worldwide, on the strategy?
Yep.
What was the purpose of that? Because the Israeli Prime Minister is saying we are doing in order to be able to bring back the 100,000 refugees that were evacuated from their houses and from their homes in the north. So what is the line that connects the dots?
Yeah.
Will Nasrallah just give up after this, from his point of view, horrific disaster that just attacked his organization? I'm not sure. And
Right.
this is sometime, and I think also a point that I'm trying to make in Rise and Kill. First, it's that you have those magnificent, way beyond enemy lines capabilities, but what exactly is the strategy? You engage, you attack the Israel, meaning they are very much into attacking the enemy at spot, but where exactly they are leading, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure that we know even today, a week after, what exactly Prime Minister Netanyahu is heading to.
And of course, David has an extraordinary career which is very enviable, I suppose, to most of us, which is he started in the CIA, went to McKinsey as a management consultant, and has ended up as this best-selling spy writer, which is, quite an impressive career. I wanted to ask you, from your experience, just to reflect a bit on whether this week represents a new level in the intelligence war, but also from your own writing, really, why you've chosen to write fiction rather than non-fiction. So Ronen, sitting next to you, is writing non-fiction, but you are writing fiction, but with, the extraordinary revelations within your books about spycraft and what it really means. And actually, Alex's predecessor, Sir John Sawyers, who I happened to see a few days ago, literally said to me, Damascus Station is the single best book he's ever read about spycraft. So can you just give us a few reflections to start with before we get into the bigger issues?
Yeah, certainly. I think maybe there was some element of switching from writing for intelligence products to fiction, because there's a deep part of me that does enjoy making shit up, and so I kind of I get a bit of a thrill out of that. But I worked on Syria when I was at the agency for most of my time there, and these sort of questions were the type of thing that I was writing about and thinking about 24/7. And I worked on that topic at a time when sort of the Assad regime was tottering, and you had the unrest from the Arab Spring beginning. And I sort of got to a point where I realized that many of these big strategic questions about the future of the region and whether there are prospects for peace and things like that are, fundamentally important and fascinating and must be discussed, but that I was really interested in exploring them through a very kind of human lens. And I just wanted to, I felt like all of the work I had done on the Syrian civil war was taking place at this very high kind of geostrategic level, and there were immense consequences down at the level of individual people. Yeah. And to me, that was the attraction, kind of writing these books, was the ability to see and put myself sort of in the shoes of people who are, in the case of the first novel, Damascus Station, living through this very, how can you be human? What are the different ways that you remain human in the middle of a very kind of inhuman conflict? And so that was my journey to writing these types of books.
Thank you. And there is always a danger that in these discussions one forgets the appalling human consequences of this.
Absolutely.
And the pictures from Gaza of the almost total destruction are just very hard to look at.
Yeah.
And that's a good segue to Jasmine. I wanted to ask you to start with, Jasmine, from a slightly personal perspective. You had actually officially retired from these issues. You had set up a company to do something completely different. And you said to me yesterday that you'd actually just felt a year ago that you had to get re-involved. And I'd love you to just talk to us a bit about why you felt so strongly about it.
Thank you. Yes, I had tried to retire from Middle East politics, but as you know, it just doesn't allow you to, life. I think the reason I wanted to become involved again goes back to why I started working on the Middle East in the first place, which was a complete accident. But after 9/11, I think like a lot of people in my generation, it was a shocking event, and I think especially for an Arab American and from someone from a Muslim family, to see sort of your two worlds being going to war with each other, and having to pick a side and having to choose: are you American? Are you Arab? Are you Muslim? Can you be both? Can you be everything? And wanting to find answers to those questions. And I ended up going to Iraq as a translator. I was 20 years old. I was just out of college, and I think in a moment of utter helplessness about everything that was happening around in the world, I felt useful. I felt like I had a part to play, that I was able to help these two sides, communicate with each other, and in doing so realize that maybe they weren't on two different sides after all. And I know that sounds cliche maybe, but sort of trying to help people understand the humanity, the common humanity, through communication. And I felt like I had found my niche. A couple of years later, I ended up volunteering to go work at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, also as a translator and a cultural advisor. And this was in 2004, so it was I wasn't involved in any of the stuff that happened before that. But I was involved in something called the Administrative Review Boards, which for the first time since the detainees had arrived at Gitmo, the Supreme Court of the United States had forced the Bush administration to tell these detainees why they were there for the first time. And I was involved in hearing their stories and translating them, and then translating, during the tribunals. And eventually most of these detainees ended up being released because they actually were found to be not guilty of anything other than being Arabs living in Afghanistan, who had stayed after the war with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and who we supported as the West. They ended up staying there, having families, and woke up on September 12th in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the wrong ethnicity. But it struck me how at Guantanamo, it didn't matter. These stories didn't matter because, and I think you'll appreciate this as a literary, audience. Once you put a uniform on someone, then they become a character. Once you put an orange jumpsuit on someone, they became a terrorist, no matter what their actual story was or where they were from and what they were doing. And once you put a U.S. military uniform on somebody, they became an imperialist, colonialist, all of that stuff, and you were just forced into these roles. And what I tried to do was help remove people from those roles into them as humans. Then I found myself at the Pentagon a few years later working on the Middle East from a policy perspective, and like David, sort of being very frustrated at the fact that we just simply weren't looking at people in the region as humans, that they were just numbers, they were problems, at best to be ignored. Please, Jake Sullivan's most, now infamous line just before October 7th, the Middle East has never been quieter. As if that was a success. We just want them to be quiet. At best, at worst, we just want to eliminate the problem, neutralize, right? But we don't think about the region as people with hopes and dreams. And again, I feel like I'm bordering a bit on cliche, but these are humans, and these are humans who have stories and lives. And one of the things that haunt me to close just this session this set of remarks is hearing someone in Gaza say, if I die, I don't want to just be a number. I want people to know my name. And it haunts me every day because imagine, can you imagine dying and just being a number, not having a grave, not having your name written? where someone can visit you, and that's everywhere in the region, you know? I mean, Ronen and I talk all the time, Israel, Palestine. At the end of the day, these are real fears that people have and traumas. And I was frustrated at the lack of inclusion of that human story on October 7th. Everybody was so quick to just jump to their camp, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine. What does that even mean? And so I thought I have to come back in and try to talk about this is about humans, lest we forget.
Very good. Very good. So, Alex, I want to move the conversation on a little bit now to this question of escalation, because a lot of what you hear from the experts at the moment is we must de-escalate. You know, we must de-escalate. You know, things are looking worse. But I suppose sometimes people from the outside will also say, what does that actually mean? You know, Iran is quite close to getting a nuclear weapon. Netanyahu doesn't seem to want the peace plan. Hamas doesn't seem to want the peace plan. What do we really mean by de-escalation in the context of this tit-for-tat proxy war which has been going on? And are we on the verge of some even worse regional war, do you think?
Well, look, I think what we mean is not having a war, by the way. I mean, I think... but just to come back to that in a moment, we've talked about humans a lot, and can I just briefly say that I was in the previous session with William Boyd, who's an author I absolutely revere, and he's written a book, I haven't read it yet, but apparently it's a sort of picture of a spy. And then there was a moment where I nearly put up my hand, where he talked about it's about the way in which being a spy corrodes the human condition, the corrosive effect, right? And I hope you've heard from both David and me that we're about human beings, that is what we do, but fundamentally it's actually a belief in human agency and a focus on the human dimension. So what Ronen talks about is really important, but Ronen would agree it's a function fundamentally of how humans interact and how they behave. At the heart of my critique of this problem, therefore, is the observation that without a political dimension, we're not going anywhere. There's a ton of wisdom in this room. My only sort of offering as a practitioner with 15 years of counter-terrorist operations and leadership under my belt is that terrorism is not a military phenomenon, it's a political phenomenon. It doesn't come to an end without a political plan. You can't kill everybody. So to the extent that I'm optimistic or pessimistic, it's around our capacity to generate those things. On the specifics of escalation, I would say two things. Firstly, relating to what I've just said, my view of, Israel has got the tactical initiative at the moment. It's demonstrated overwhelming intelligence and technical dominance of its potential adversary. I don't think it's got the strategic initiative, but it's got the tactical initiative. And what is going on, I think, is actually largely driven in a very reactive way by Netanyahu's domestic political situation. And he's blocked, because of his political circumstances, from green-lighting progress towards a ceasefire in Gaza. Let's be clear, by the way, in Gaza, the head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, is a psychopathic nihilist who wants to bring down the roof on his head. That is the genesis of all of this. But it is frustrating to see how Netanyahu clearly does not have the space to allow politics to move forward in Gaza. And without that, I'm pessimistic about longer term
just to be clear, when you say he doesn't have the space, do you mean because of the coalition he's trying to hold together?
Yeah, there's that, and then this is a heavy thing to put on anyone, but there's also the fact that when the war stops, he's going to have some questions to ask. But,
yes,
I don't know him, I'm not really going to go there on that. Okay. So this puts him in a particularly difficult position with his other problem, which is 60,000 Israelis have been displaced from the north by the threat of Hezbollah rockets, and he sort of hasn't found a solution to that. He hasn't got a solution to that. Israel's invaded Lebanon twice, in 1982 and 2006, both times completely counterproductive. First time actually created Hezbollah. So it's not performative, it's real, and it's bloody dangerous, but actually I think it's more about demonstrating the profound capabilities on the Israelis' part and trying to push this thing onto the back burner, trying to push Hezbollah back from the frontier. But to Ronen's point, I really struggle to see what the strategy is. Where's the end game on this?
Yeah.
And if I was to have a dark moment on the 90th anniversary of the First World War, roughly, I'd worry about a sort of element of automaticity that is now lent by this sort of tactical success, because this tactical success would have huge meaning in the context of a broader strategy. As a sort of preliminary move, it would be genius, but it's not an end in
Yes,
itself.
you both say that it's not actually part of
Yeah.
some broader...
Yeah, so if it was, but I don't think it is. I think this is about Netanyahu, who is ultimately more of a poker player than a chess player, I think. Second point, though, and again, I think my authority on this is that I was brought up in the shadow war, is that like we really do all know the rules of the shadow war. They're very clearly articulated. And the bias is generally to go back into those well-understood zones. So when we had that very dangerous exchange of missiles in the summer, I was relatively clear, notwithstanding, of course, the risk of miscalculation, that Iran would attempt to calibrate its response in those terms, and it wasn't particularly successful. But I do think that's what's going on here. So to reassure you, I think there's a broad bias to get back into the safe space of the shadow war. Arguably, they're already at war with Lebanon, but it's within these defined parameters. And for a broader audience, quite apart from the human aspects, we worry about the sort of global stability aspects. I think that's quite a strong dampener. But this does quickly get to Iran, and I'm sure we'll have a wider conversation about Iran. So I just restrict myself now to saying that I believe that Iranian foreign policy over the last 30 years, which has largely been constructed by the Quds Force, the bit of the Revolutionary Guards that deals with overseas, has been extraordinarily clever and strategically well-founded. And in the creation of a set of proxy forces inside fragile states, which are then supplied with strategic weapons, Iran has found a very cheap way of making life very expensive for the rest of us and dialing up the tension up and down according to its foreign policy interests in a way that doesn't accord it consequences that it should normally deserve. It is, I think, it's a case study of clear-sighted strategic thinking that I frankly wish we could emulate. The issue, this is my final point, is that the quality of Iranian foreign policy activity is not matched by their domestic situation. And I think the issue inside Iran is there's a slow-moving car crash going on. The theocratic regime know that they've lost the younger half of Iran. They're rattled by it, but really only have a strategy of doubling down. And that, I think, in time is going to... That's where I think a paradigm shift may well come.
Oh, you think a paradigm... When you say that, I mean, is that code for...
Well,
you actually think the regime might fall?
No, so this is a really important point. Remember, we heard it first. Heads of MI6 should not predict when there's going to be a coup in Iran because we've got really bad historical form.
Very true.
So I'm not doing that on the timing, but I am saying that there's a tectonic nature here, which is that the regime has entirely lost its credibility. Khamenei is about to die. There's, to my mind, a sort of slow-moving military coup going on in Iran where the IRGC are slowly just taking over. But that's complicated now by, for instance, the election of Masoud Pezeshkian, which is clearly the regime trying to maneuver in some way to give space to its opponents, but without any real idea of how to do that. And the regime is actually signaling that they want to coup it. Now, whether you want to take that at face value or not, at the same time, they're exporting missiles to Ukraine and stuff, so it's not straightforward. But they're certainly signaling they want to coup it. And that is, I think, the key part of the answer to your question, Camilla, because ultimately, the escalatory timetable is driven by, I think, this Iranian dynamic, but the wild card is how Netanyahu sees this fitting into his more immediate and expedient priorities. Well,
and I wanted to come back to Netanyahu. So, Ronen, I wanted to come back to you to pick up on that point about if you're both saying that Israel's move is essentially tactical, not strategic, and a lot of your critique in the book, I think, of Israel is that it has tended to be too tactical and not sufficiently strategic. Do you think it is possible for progress to be made while Netanyahu remains in place? Is that something that is possible? I mean, I might ask David or Jasmine. No, yeah.
The longer is that Netanyahu, there was a famous colleague, writer, journalist in Israel, who once said about Netanyahu, he said, all politicians usually have themselves at the center and everything else in the background. For Netanyahu, he said, there's no background. I think this is a very good description. Unfortunately, very true. And Netanyahu is putting the integrity of his coalition as the first priority, second and third. There's nothing beyond that. He's willing to sacrifice the hostages, the region, the country, in order to save his coalition and save himself from his trial, from the inquiry panel that will be established, from the next elections, from everything. And he's not thinking about the vote in the next election. He's only thinking about the 64 seats that he has now out of 120 in the cabinet. So the only way that, I think that there are two ways here. One is elections, and we just don't know. He's really a super master of political maneuvers. And no one has been able to take down his government, his coalition, even after the fiasco of October 7, that he is the one blamed and responsible more than anyone else, because he is the leader of the executive branch. So it's either elections or some more powerful force that would coerce him to take something that will be more important than his coalition. That could be a very strong American pressure, which unfortunately we do not see, because I think something like a month ago, the US has made a decision not to quarrel with Netanyahu because of their coming elections.
Right. So that's exactly where I want to go.
Can I just
Next.
add one
Yes.
thing which we missed, was that when the Oslo Accords were signed, Israel was a very different country to what it is now. The wall then came down. And I hesitate to do this in front of an Israeli, but it seems to me there was a whole Jewish community behind what was the Iron Curtain that came to Israel that didn't have the same secular tradition, that has had much higher demographic birth rate, etc. So I think Netanyahu is a significant part of the issue, but I think Israel has structurally, politically moved to the right as well.
Interesting point. Can I just come to David and Jasmine on the US question? Jasmine, what do you think what role do you think the US should play? I mean, as Ronen said, I think there's a sense that until the election on November 5th, nothing much is going to change. But what constructive role do you think the US could play either before or after that? And will it make a difference who wins the American election, or is that actually not the central point?
So for those of you who don't know, David and I yesterday realized that we had overlapped exactly while he was at the CIA and I was at DOD. And once we found that out, we had like a little therapy session between the two of us last night, I would say.
PTSD,
where we just vented about US policy in the region. And I think the short answer is nothing is going to change between now and the election. I mean, tell me if you think I'm wrong, I think effectively the US has given up hope on a ceasefire. It's just not going to happen. And the real sort of priority right now is to make sure we get to November 5th with no huge, incident, if that can even be said. They're just coasting. In terms of what the U.S. should do differently, I mean, I think, when we talked about this yesterday, the U.S. policy in the Middle East for decades has been, Band-Aids over bullet holes. Just put a Band-Aid on, hope it goes away, and never actually addressing, the wounds, the root causes of the conflicts. Why are people attracted to Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis? Why do people support organizations like that? Is it ideology? Is it transactional? Is it because they want to just be fed and clothed and that's the only organization that does it? So we've never really dug into those issues because, and you guys will understand this, we run on election cycles. Nobody wants to make the real tough choices, even though they know that certain choices in the short term will be painful, but in the long term, there is a brighter future, because in the short term, politicians have to win elections and they have to win midterm elections, and they, so it's really difficult to have. I mean, when we look at visionary leaders, when we look at the past, when you look at Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who went to Egypt and just said, "Hey, this is it. I'm done. We need to have peace." So I guess I'll end by just saying, I think if I can think of a sliver of hope of what's happened, because of October 7th and the war on Gaza is that I think the U.S. has finally started to understand that it has to somehow get to a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because until you do that, you just, no matter how many economic normalization deals, if you cannot solve this problem, you will always come back to it, and something needs to be done.
Right. David, what's your perspective?
I think when you look at our policy more broadly in the region over the past generation or so, when we articulate policy objectives that are sort of almost negative, the destruction of something, we're actually quite good at matching sort of ends and means, and the rhetoric is sort of resourced, I think. You look at, removing Saddam, removing the Taliban. We're great at flying B-1 bombers to, attack militias in Syria and Iraq. So all of that or serving as the Air Force to, get Gaddafi out of Libya. We're quite good when the goals are framed in kind of a negative sense. Some of the more military security stuff on counterterrorism with respect to the Islamic State was resourced fairly effectively. A coalition was built. When we frame objectives in the positive sense of having to construct or feeling that we are now in charge of constructing a viable, central government in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in Libya, we're not so good at it. And we have this massive gap that appears between sort of what we say we're going to do and what we say our objectives are and what we actually are able to accomplish or resource. And I think that there's a lot of different reasons for that. I think some of them have to do with talent in our foreign policy establishment. I think some of it has to do with failure of imagination. I think some of it has to do with the reality that the region does not border us and is distant. And some of it is that we're unable, I think, to sort of articulate real strategic objectives in the region and then go after them. We tend to say we're going to do everything, and we're really only able to do things in kind of a military security sense when we feel the need to break something. And I don't see, when we sort of look at the American electorate now, you think about the level of sort of interest in the region, it's very low, I think.
Is
and
it?
I
Because I
think
was
so.
wondering whether one of the reasons that Jasmine made that point about, you're saying the penny's sort of finally dropped in a different kind of way about the need for Palestinian state. I was wondering if that is actually partly driven by greater public awareness of this since the Gaza conflict.
I think there's obviously immense resonance to the conflict in the States, but I don't see that. I have yet to see that channeled into an effective sort of policy-making approach that takes that domestic political energy and translates it into an outcome, in the Middle East, whether it's Arab-Israeli, whether it's something with the Iranians. And I'm not, there are examples in the past 20 years of the U.S. achieving, mediation roles or Abraham Accords. I mean, you can give some examples, but in general, I think those are the exception that sort of prove the rule.
But that's the hope that I have, though, is that will, I do believe that if Kamala Harris wins, I do believe that we're going to start to see domestic pressure translate into something different. She may lose Michigan because of this. She may, lose other states, Arab Americans, not just Arab Americans, by the way. I mean, like I said, there's no, one camp or the other. I mean, I'm say the pro-peace camp, the human rights camp, the justice camp. I mean, they have made their voices heard and they have started to organize politically. And I think that a Harris administration will be receptive to that. I am hopeful in that sense. Trump is, of course, a completely different, manner.
Do we actually have any idea? And I always worry about predicting anything Trump will do because he's famously unpredictable. I mean, do any of you on the panel have any feelings about what he would do in this context if he becomes president again?
I think he will want to prove that he got the deal that Biden couldn't, and that he will try to actually get a deal. But you guys may disagree. Okay. But I think that he will be so satisfied with making the deal that.
Oh, that's another point. Well, I want to come on to you now because I want to take some questions as well in a minute. So, I mean, to come back to the overall headline of the session, which is there a possible path? Ronen, I mean, you have seen Israeli intelligence to an extraordinary level, and you are, as I understand it, currently reviewing secret Hamas documents. And I wonder if you're able at this point to say whether there is anything that has surprised you in that review, and how that has shaped your view of what the future can look like.
I think that one conclusion from the last year on the positive side is that there is a very strong coalition, the US, UK, France, and many moderate countries in the Middle East that would support the right of Israel to exist, would defend Israel in case of Iranian attack, as we saw on April 13 and 14, and would support a two-state solution, and would pay and give much resources to that. And currently, unfortunately, it is the Israeli Prime Minister who is the main obstacle from looking at the next day, the next page in the history, and turning the page into something more optimistic, and bringing the Palestinian Authority into Gaza as an alternative to Hamas, because this war will never end until there's an alternative to Hamas, and this is what Netanyahu is trying to stop. On the more concerning, what I see in the classified Hamas documents that we are looking at now, again, not scooping myself, but I'll tell you that there is an ongoing sense of jihad in these documents. These people, the leadership of Hamas, and not just the internal one in Gaza, but also the so-called political bureau of Hamas, they were up to what they called in the classified documents of Mashru al-Kabir, the big project. From 2012, they were promoting that project, and that project is how to take Israeli defenses down and conquer part of the Israeli southern hemisphere. Israel assassinated the chief of staff, Abu Muhsin, the chief of staff of Hezbollah. In his computer, they found detailed plan how to eradicate the state of Israel. Not in the sense of idea, not in the sense of slogan, but actual ideas. I believe that you need the coalition, very strong coalition I mentioned in the first part of my comment, in order to fight very strongly the jihadist elements. And I'm not sure, my surprise, and it's not just surprise, it's also a lot of sadness, because the last thing I want to do is to admit I was wrong. This is very hard for me. But I think that these people, the leadership of Hamas, the leadership of Hezbollah, they are not to be, they could be threatened and could be feel intimidated and stand down for a time. But at the basis of what they do is jihad. And we need a very strong coalition in the Middle East to fight them, take them down, because they will not stop.
Wow. Alex, I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to finish with Jasmine, and then I'm going to open it to questions. So, given that, do you see a path, and what do you think the role of other actors is? I mean, Qatar is obviously another actor we haven't talked about.
Well, I'd say two things, one pessimistic, one more optimistic. It was a very good talk with William Dalrymple and Seabag Montefiore did before, where they talked about the way in which power is being dispersed across the globe relative to our experience of the unipolar moment, and the way in which that's basically weakened America's willingness to police the global system, where China isn't really interested in taking that mantle, and where Russia's interested in making it worse. And this doesn't just describe the anarchy we see in Gaza. And the Sudan war, which we haven't mentioned, which is on its way to being just as terrible, is this thawing and unlocking of ancient enmities that were actually locked in place in colonial times with the drawing of random borders. All that's coming to life now, sort of zombie-like. And I'm not sure we have an answer. And that augurs, regrettably, chronic instability of this nature, and will undermine the ability to get this sort of international concerted effort that is required to deal with this. That's the pessimistic point. The optimistic point is simply this: why did Hamas launch the attack on October the 7th? The answer is because they were losing the argument. It was going away from them. No, I don't agree with everything, many aspects of Donald Trump's foreign policy, but the Abraham Accords asserted normalization in a very practical way, and it was developing a degree of momentum. So the extremists, Netanyahu to some extent, but certainly Hamas, were losing their grip. So there is, even if the international community just doesn't have what it takes to assert order in this space, within the region there are a set of dynamics afoot that are actually inimical to the interests of the extremists. There's an Iran dimension to that as well. And if those can be made to progress, you get to the golden position that Ronen outlines. This doesn't end unless your average Palestinian feels an alternative of some kind.
Yeah.
And that's
Absolutely.
called politics. The reason we failed in
And what you're
Afghanistan
saying is that's the political solution. It cannot be a military. So that's what you're all basically saying.
I was in Afghanistan. We were defeated because we thought there was a military solution, and there wasn't.
Yeah.
So to the extent that that can happen, and I think we generally underestimate the capacity for positive change in that space, we can be more optimistic.
Jasmine, are you able to leave us on a slightly more optimistic note?
I will rise to that challenge. I wrote something down that I wanted to share with all of you because I wanted to make sure that I remembered the names. Speaking of names and how people want their names to be remembered. There was an Israeli man, his name was Rami El-Hanan, who was the son of a Holocaust survivor and the father of a 14-year-old Israeli girl, Smadar El-Hanan, who died in a terrorist suicide bombing. And he said, we have to find a way to share this land. Otherwise, we will have to share it as two huge graveyards. We have to find a way to share this land. He was able to overcome his pain and talk about peace. There was a Palestinian woman named Abla Khatib, and she was the mother of a 12-year-old boy, Ahmed Khatib, who was killed by the IDF because they thought his toy gun was a real one. She donated his organs to 6 Israeli children. And she said, I didn't want to see my son suffer, and I don't want to see other children suffer, no matter where they're from. These people are not exceptions. You will find examples of people like this throughout the region, brave, courageous, who are able to come up with the most extraordinary acts of goodness and courage, and they need support. They need support. If we are policymakers, we have to support them. They have organizations. They're running for office. They have tangible ways of asking for support, and they ask for our support. If we are writers, if we are journalists, we have to amplify them. If we are authors, we have to tell their stories, and we have to reveal that sense of faith and hope and courage so that people recognize it in each other and can build upon it. They need our help in order to do that. And I think if we are able to do that, if we are able to go to the peace activists, to the peace builders, to the people who want to build bridges and find ways to support them and talk about them and provide them with platforms to tell their stories, then I do believe that there is a path forward to peace, and it will be built by them.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Right, we have about 9 minutes for questions. So do we have mics, or are people just standing up from... Yes, you've got a mic there. So there's a gentleman here with glasses. If you could get a mic just here in the white jacket. And then there's a lady right in the back standing up by the lampshade. If we can get the next mic to her. Yes, sir.
So the two-state solution was only mentioned once. Thank you, Ronen. My question is this. Do the panel see any way forward to peace without a two-state solution?
Who wants to take that? Alex?
I think that the two-state solution has to some extent become an unhelpful shorthand for a very long-term aspiration. But I do go back to what I said earlier, which if Palestinians don't see that they have an alternative to at least passive acquiescence to the extremist agenda, this is going to go on forever. I think in practical terms what that means, sort of Kissinger-like, it's about time. I think the West is in danger of overplaying its hand and imposing a fantastic version of this solution, which will not be believed by anyone and therefore won't occur. But equally, when I look at it and I look at all the complexity, and I completely understand the obstacles, particularly in the mind of the average Israeli, where trust is just gone and they feel completely embattled. It's impossible to avoid the conclusion that without some dispensation for the Palestinians, this will never end. And in the approach of the region, it's interesting. I think countries like Saudi Arabia are now making it very clear that the price of further normalization is movement. So I think, it sounds fantastic. It sounds like we're bereft of ideas, but it just, there's a reason we keep on coming back to this. But I think that the British government's formulation is good. They want a horizon to a Palestinian state. But I think trying to just impose it, as we sort of learned in Iraq, just make a state, that's not really a thing.
Anybody else want to respond? Or should I move on?
Well, I mean, I'm just sorry to put a spotlight that His Royal Highness the Saudi ambassadors here. There is a plan. There's an Arab peace initiative that's been on the table, for decades now. There is a plan. We know what it looks like. Is it realistic anymore after October 7th? I mean, certainly things have shifted. There's a lot of trauma that has to be worked through, but there is a plan. It's been there.
Thank you. Lady at the back.
For your talk. My question is, if there's a child currently in Palestine whose mother, father, 4 siblings have been killed, for instance, this month, by Netanyahu's attack, if he grows up to become a 30-year-old man who remembers the trauma that he suffered as a child and goes to the edge of the Palestinian border and decides, right, I'm going to make sure that I defend this border so that my children do not suffer the same fate. If he does so without joining any group at all, but successfully wants to defend his border, how should Netanyahu treat him any differently to someone who is actually Hamas? And should he? And if so, how differently? And the second question is, in terms of intervention, should we direct our finances towards providing Palestine with an Iron Dome as well?
Oh, interesting question. Right. There's 2 separate questions there. Ronen, do you want to take?
I'm not sure I understood could you repeat the one on...
So I think were you asking the question of how Netanyahu should treat... I mean, effectively, I suppose we've all been discussing this risk that someone who, with that kind of, in that traumatic situation would have a certain, might come to the border. You're asking how should Netanyahu treat that person? That's the question? Yes, so should he be making a distinction is what you're saying. Is that right?
We have more and more evidence on how draconian Hamas rule was in Gaza, not against Israelis, but against Palestinians. The New York Times just last Saturday published an investigative report about the atrocities and the crimes of Hamas against Palestinian people. They were running an internal Stasi-like police that was calling people to snitch on their neighbors, chasing on gays, accusing people, following journalists, and torturing journalists for voicing opinions against Hamas and much, much others. So I think that this regime was not just about Israel, it was about Palestinians, and I'm sure that if we now know that they even fabricated the results of the public polls on how many people are in favor of Hamas. The right wing in Israel are using the polls run by Khalil Shkaki to say 70%. Now we know that it's only 25%, but Hamas fabricated the results. They are very, very sensitive to the way that they are being portrayed outside. So the short answer, of course, if someone is demonstrating that Israel, anyone should treat a demonstration in a very different way than any act of terrorism. But I do wish that when this child grows up, he will meet with a very different reality. And this reality will need both sides, as Jasmine said, both sides, and many people that were directly hurt, lost relatives. Each one in Israel know people who were either killed or lost. Yara and I have a person who lost his daughter on the Nova party, and he was looking for days, just looking for her body in the cars of the people that were trying to flee the. And then I found a video of them trying to flee the scene, and Hamas were butchering them. We will need reconciliation, and each side will need to give up on their zeal of revenge in order to create, and I do hope that that person will not need to demonstrate because he will meet a totally different reality in 18 years or so.
There's lots of questions, so I'm going to take 3 questions together. Is that all right? And then the panel can answer. Guy standing up with a hand up, gentleman here with glasses. With your hand up. And then there's somebody at the back sort of with their hand up. Sorry, I can't see very well. So if we could take those 3, is that all right? I'm sorry, others, we're running out of time.
So people always wrongly assume that the Islamic regime in Iran's biggest export is oil, but it's not. It's failed states and terror proxies. It's strange to me that no one is asking why it is that countries and territories that are allied with this regime, like Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, and Gaza, are plagued by violence, failed governance, and economic ruin, while those embracing peace with Israel, such as the UAE and Bahrain, are peaceful and flourishing. How can the mullahs, which have fueled conflict, including this one, terrorism, and the death of over 1 million Muslims between Syria and Yemen, not be seen as the problem and not attract any negative press, while Israel is blamed and seen as a pariah?
Thank you. Gentleman here.
What role is China playing in this conflict, and what are their objectives, and how does that fit in with the whole situation?
Very good. And the gentleman back.
My question is about the wider region again. I mean, all these other wars. What do you think about will happen in the Syrian civil war, ongoing, 500,000 people dead, Sudan, Yemen, and even the tensions that exist in Egypt, Bahrain, and other parts of the wider Middle East?
Thank you. Should we start with Syria, David?
Sure. I think I don't see a sort of political, sort of a negotiated settlement to that conflict, which largely has sort of kind of frozen, right? I think that more broadly, you look at sort of and plays into your regional point as well. If you look at the ingredients that I think fed some progress in the region back in the 90s and early 2000s, very few of them are there today, right? You had a region of states that were, controlled largely by strong men, but were able to do deals, were constructed coherent entities that could govern within their borders. You don't really have that anymore. You have a string of failed states from the Sahel to Afghanistan, and warlordism, which is a massive problem in Syria today. You had a construct where basically, the Israelis had demonstrated they could defeat states militarily, and so there was a process in place to try to negotiate peace. I mean, now you have, Iranian proxies, clients, partners on Israel's borders that think they can actually, to Ronen's point, defeat and undermine the state. And you have a Washington that had played a role of sort of, or at least tried to be an objective broker to some of this, and had the will and kind of the resourcing to do it that's not there anymore. So I think, you sort of, a lot of the ingredients, a lot of the way we talk about the region even comes out of that era, and it's just no longer the case. And, I think my pessimism on Syria, I take off my novelist hat and put on my intelligence analyst hat. It's hard to imagine any kind of sort of, it's a pretty dark picture, I think, when you look at that conflict going forward.
Thanks. I'm going to come to Alex on China in a minute, but Ronen or Jasmine, do either of you want to address this question, which I think the gentleman was saying Iran exports failed states, and that is not sufficiently criticised, and there's an imbalance. Do either of you want to address that?
I mean, I would disagree with the fact that it's not being criticized for its actions. I mean, Iran is clearly, the regime in Iran is a bad actor in the region, and people in the region know it. And people in the region are resentful of Iranian support for those proxies that are causing trouble in their countries. And, but I think we have to dig a little deeper when we look into the causes behind, it's not as simple as countries who have peace with Israel are doing better than countries who don't have peace with Israel. And I mean, I think that's a happy coincidence. I don't think it's the reason. I was in Beirut. I was, I don't mean to sound like Thomas Friedman. I was in a cab in Beirut. But I was in a cab in Beirut, and I was talking to the cab driver who was a Hezbollah supporter, for whatever that means. And I was like, why do you support Hezbollah? I mean, don't they do all these awful things and blah blah blah? And he said, because after the 2006 war with Israel and Hezbollah, my home was destroyed. It was in the southern suburbs of Beirut, and I wanted to get my life back together and fix it. I tried to go to the government. They gave me the runaround for months on end. I couldn't get any government support to fix my house. And I went to the Hezbollah office in the southern suburbs, and I asked for help, and they cut me a check, and I fixed my house. And so, there are reasons beyond just, ideological, Sunni, Shia. I mean, these are the things that we often read about, and they're simplistic. They offer an easy, answer to complicated questions. But at the end of the day, people in the region, they want to go to school, they want to fix their houses, they want to live, and whoever's going to provide them with that is going to have their support. And unfortunately, you have a lot of governments in the Middle East who don't have at the top of their priority list taking care of their own people.
Thank you.
And so Iran capitalizes on the failures of the governments, It funds, these organizations, but Iran didn't create the problems that are sort of leading to people supporting one organization or the other. I think it's a bit broader than that.
Thank you. We're going to have to move incredibly quickly. I'm sorry, because I think this room is needed. So, Alex, can you quickly respond to the question about China?
Two things quickly. So, first of all, China doesn't actually have much Western in the region. It does a bit of performative diplomacy, some of which hasn't been bad. And it's conflicted. It likes a weaker America, but it also is a net energy importer. So that, I think that's meant that they've actually been very cautious around all of this. The big point, and a failure, frankly, of my generation of securocrats, is we did not take sufficiently seriously the profound strategic significance of the axis of authoritarianism. And we just thought that, an alliance between Iran and Russia and North Korea and China just sounded like the start of a joke. But what it means is that the capacity to isolate any of these players now and enforce good behavior is moot. That's not an option that we have anymore. So we're maneuvering in a completely different space. And this is where I think the guiding sort of Xi Jinping pitch to the developing world that states should just be allowed to pursue their own interests is so destructive to the sort of community of effort that is necessary and sort of isn't going to go away.
Great, thank you for ending on that note, and thank you all for your civilised questions. Thanks for coming.